It's Tuesday, so it's time for me to fix the meta. Welcome back to another FAUXTA. Today, we'll be going through what I would do if I were in charge of the upcoming OTA and tasked to balance the metagame. We'll be starting with Mother Ascani, a card whose play rate has been astronomical recently, and because of that, may not necessarily have the win rates on public trackers that people would be afraid of. But this is a card that is going in a ton of different spaces, and I think it's reasonable that to describe this card as one that increases the amount of games that play out similarly over the course of Marvel Snap. One of my goals when doing these is to make the experience of playing Marvel Snap better. I tend to think of that as one of the three pillars of my FAUXTA system. And I think that it's pretty reasonable to describe a card that duplicates in the way that Mother Ascani does as a thing that increases redundancy in decks and makes more games play out the same way. By being able to duplicate your most powerful cards and using more of your energy on those most powerful cards, you very often end up in the higher end of your range and games start to feel the same. So I just want to depower her a little bit. First things first, I took a point of power off of her as a card from 4/4 to 4/3. Then I also took a point of power off of her ability. Now, instead of giving 2 power, it gives 1 power. So we're taking a lot off of her here. When people nerf things and I pay attention to how the community sort of thinks about this stuff, a lot of what they try to do is change specific wordings and interactions, and I think that's sort of not the direction that I like approaching it from. I like approaching things from the simplest possible, most straightforward way to deal with something. And I learned this from proposing some stuff to Glenn Jones the last time I did one of these. They tend to think a fairly similar way, or at least Glenn did, rest in peace. Now, this is a change that I think is not aimed at specific interaction, but is more aimed at saying, this card's a little too strong, let's take some numbers off of it. This is effectively like 3 power off of the card whenever you play it. It's actually a pretty substantial nerf. My thinking is that a lot of the community will be like, well, this isn't enough. And I find that not necessarily hard to believe, but I would find it hard to believe that you can know for sure that it's not going to be enough. I tend to take a light hand. That's another one of my pillars on newer cards that people have just paid for. It takes a lot for me to feel like it's a good idea to rug pull someone, and I think that we've seen in recent days, in recent weeks even, that they may not necessarily have this compunction. They certainly nerfed Star-Lord harder than I would, but I do try to find a solution that is a numbers-based solution a lot of the time, rather than something like changing the fundamentals of how a card works, like, say, making Ascani give the buff after it copies. Things like that do have an associated cost of people have a certain play pattern in their mind for what this card is, and it is kind of a jump to get past it, so I try to avoid them when I think I have a good numbers solution, and I do think this is a pretty reasonable numbers solution. Next up is Prodigy. I've been banging the drum about copy effects for an extended period of time in Marvel Snap, and Prodigy, it feels like to me, just has 1 point of power too many, and this is a really easy chance to just get that 1 point of power off of Prodigy. This is in reference to the Captain Carter combo deck, which notably did not do amazingly well in the Golden Gauntlet, but there were a lot of Shadow Kings running around, and I don't like the idea of the entire metagame hanging on Shadow King in order to not get run over by various combo decks using green power, and Prodigy is a pretty important piece of this. Now, my reasons for wanting to depower the copiers of these effects are twofold. The first is they are very difficult to play. Prodigy specifically is a very hard card to play with a lot of weird interactions in it, which means that it's typically hard for it to get to the level of justifying a nerf across all player bases. So this is definitely one that's aimed a little bit more at high elo. The second thing is that he just keeps showing up and making games play out the same. It's the same objection I have to Mother Ascani. It's the objection I have to all these copiers. Not only is the problem that when you make a balance mistake, they intensify your balance mistake by giving people 2 copies of your balance mistake. They also make games play out similarly more than other cards would. And I think that they have been given stat lines that are too generous and have not taken this into account. And so part of what I'm doing in this FAUXTA is advocating for them to have slightly less power. I don't want to change everything about the card, but I do want to dunk Prodigy down to 3 power. And I want to do the same to the Grandmaster for similar reasons. I think Grandmaster is a little bit less justifiable as a nerf than Prodigy, but frankly, it's been 4 months of this guy, and I think the more they have to balance around what happens if we create a good on reveal and Grandmaster and Prodigy copy it all the time, that just seems like a bad space for them to end up in. I realize the design space argument is not one that typically gets players on the side of the person making that argument, but I do think this is one of those situations, or several of those situations, if you think of Ascani and Prodigy as part of the same thing, where copiers have gotten better and better and better over the course of Marvel Snap, while stats have not necessarily. Like, if you go back to 2023, people were playing Kraven and Silk in their stats decks, and you go to now, and people are playing Kraven and Silk in their stats decks. But what has been crept seriously is the amount of synergies and things that copy each other that have been given additional points of power beyond what I view was necessary. And so Prodigy and Grandmaster, let's just take some of those back. Let's reclaim a little bit of the ground that we have ceded to these copiers. I think Techno Organic Virus is a super cool card that I have a ton of respect for and a lot of enjoyment playing with. I think the worst thing about Techno Organic Virus is that it sort of mandates you run Mobius in your deck in much the same way as Pixie does. In other words, increasing the play rate of Mobius beyond what I would consider fun or appropriate for metagame. Unfortunately, I spent a little bit of time on this, and in terms of nerfing Techno-Organic Virus, I kind of didn't get anywhere interesting, or at least anywhere that decoupled it from Mobius. What am I going to do? Go back to the +2 power and make you even more required to play Mobius? Or the +2 cost, I should say? I got nothing on this one. So I decided that if I was mad at Mobius's play rate, I might as well just hit Mobius. And I think that this is something that I think is a good direction for them going forward. Again, one of the things that I think about a lot is, does this change make Marvel Snap more fun? Would it be a good thing to have this be more fun? My thinking is, if you need Mobius for your game plan, you're going to play him at whatever stat line. If you need Mobius to stop your opponent from doing something ridiculous, so like if Mr. Negative's 20% of the metagame, you're going to play him as a 3-2. You don't care. He says win the game on him, right? I would like these cards to have a few points less of stats. And I think that Mobius is a great place to start because he's the one that is seeing the most play and is the one that has the best offensive tie-in with Techno-Organic Virus. So I have docked Mobius a point in this, and I think that's just probably a good decision because I am a big believer that these Floodgate type cards make Marvel Snap better. But I'm a much bigger fan of like a Quicksand style Floodgate than I am a Mobius style Floodgate. And I think they make Marvel Snap better, but they make Marvel Snap better by a larger amount if they're not being played when there isn't a need for them. And I think Mobius is the most prone to being played just as a card you put in your deck. And I don't like that, and I think that he should be a card you need to go very far out of your way to get into your deck and play. So I've docked him a point of power. I have the exact same argument for docking Stardust a point of power. Mobius is much more of a problem than Stardust, but again, these are both cards that are basically only included in decks to stop specific outcomes. And I think, to be clear, it is very good that there are cards you can put in your deck to stop these specific outcomes, because otherwise Marvel Snap would not have ways for a lot of decks to compete with the decks that these decks beat. I think that is straightforwardly a good thing for Marvel Snap. But the harder it is to play these decks, the more you have to commit to get these cards into your deck, the more diversity we can have in the metagame. And I think that that is the biggest argument for me. I believe that it is better to be in a Stardust meta than a Hela meta, because not having interaction for what your opponent is doing isn't very fun. But I also believe that we can increase the distance by which it is better. Right now, I think it's not all that much better than a Hela meta to be in a Stardust meta. I think it's not all that much better than a Mr. Negative meta to be in a Mobius meta, because they have a lot of splash damage. This is more prominent with Mobius, but it still happens with Stardust. Now, as far as this card specifically goes, I think taking a point of power off of it is very justifiable for a bunch of different reasons, but largely, I would like to make it a card you are going out of your way to get in your deck to beat a specific matchup that you're actually paying a cost for. And what we've seen with Stardust and Mobius recently is that the point packages are good enough that they're very willing to do it. It is a not necessarily free inclusion, but close enough to it that I would like to dock Stardust a point as well. Part of the type of package that justifies the playing of these tech cards is, where are your points coming from? And in lieu of having a good TOV nerf specifically, I think it's pretty clear that Wilson Fisk is a secret weapon of this list. This is an unbelievably powerful card that is in not just the TOV lists, but the Supergiant lists. He's a staple of any deck that is looking to get ahead early and slam the door shut. And my contention is basically he will continue in this exact same role if he is a 3/8. There is nothing stopping him from continuing in this role as a 3/8. In fact, it is a very reasonable thing to think that he will be not necessarily just as good, but very nearly just as good as a 3/8. And that to me seems like there's no reason to not dock him a point at this point. Wilson Fisk as an effective 3/9 has been an unbelievable monster of a card. And since we are taking a point off Mobius and I don't have a good TOV nerf and like all this stuff, I want to dock the deck somewhere else, and to me, this is a way of pushing down that style of aggressive interaction heavy mid-range just a little bit. It got raised up significantly just by this card existing anyway, and it will already be better than what it was because this card will still be very good in it. But I don't think it needs that 9th point of power. And now for the fun stuff. Let's talk about the cards I would buff. All of these cards saw 0 copies brought to the Golden Gauntlet. Nobody was even interested in them. The one that I think is the most interesting is Wade Wilson, who I've decided to buff by making a 1/1. Now, the reason I think this is so crucial to Wade Wilson is that this is the kind of card that you can use to tutor your Deadpool out. And if you can do that on 1, that is a much stronger thing than doing it later. The Destroy deck loves being able to weave 1-cost cards into its curve. You've seen the cards that actually end up making the cut in the Destroy deck overwhelmingly tend to be things that cost 1. Headpool, X23. Those cards are very easy to fit in because you are often doing something that involves replaying a Deadpool, playing one of those, and then playing a thing that blows it up. Easy to fit in on your 3rd, on your 4th turn. And I think that this is the kind of card that can be a real upgrade for a deck like that as long as it has a 1 cost on it and not a 2. And I think that's a super big change that would do a lot towards revitalizing the Destroy deck, which hasn't been a serious contender in a very long time. And that makes me sad because I personally believe the Destroy is basically the exact deck you want to be the best deck in the game, let alone even being playable. Like, it's been a while since I felt good about the archetype, full stop. I would like to give it some actual juice, and I think this Wade Wilson change would actually go a long way. It also means that he would mirror both Deadpool and Headpool in stats, and I think that symmetry is a very nice thing to do. Largely, I think buffing Destroy is basically always directionally correct. And if I can do that while also buffing a card that nobody is particularly interested in right now that has a ton of thematic resonance with the Destroy package, well, that's a slam dunk to me. Next up is Mad Thinker. Mad Thinker has the typical 1-cost problem, which is that it's not really worth investing in a 1-cost card that has this much being asked of it, because the payoff on any 1 cost has to be kind of low, because it costs 1. This is a trap that they often fall into, and frankly, the only 1-cost scaler who's really broken out of that trap is Batroc. Every other 1-cost that's good is just some guy with big stats most of the time, or a card that goes in the bounce deck. So if this wants to be a Batroc level card, how do we actually make it get there? My thought process is that you'd want to buff the incentive for doing what this card is asking you to do. You can say very reasonably that this is going to be a really big card if you're hitting the condition enough of the time. And I think that 1-costs have enough inherent vulnerability, things like Killmonger and Shadow King are fairly common right now anyway, that 1-cost green power does not seem like a dangerous place to invest a powerful ability. If you're a 1-cost card that's gaining power on 1 lane and you have to be on the board to do it, my gut check is you're probably just going to be a fine balanced card almost no matter what we put on you. And so that is sort of where my head is at with changing Mad Thinker here. I want him to be a bigger threat in his own right because there's just no real incentive to do what he's doing as long as it takes him 2 or 3 procs to get to the size of a frickin' martyr. Last of the buffs is Rescue, who I'm aiming pretty squarely at the Searcher archetype or the Scar archetype. I think it's just a nice little thing to include. A 410 that does actually demand some additional commitment in order to be a 410. This feels like a buff that is not necessarily nearly as scary as they would want because it doesn't actually work with Searcher, it really just works with Scar. And I think it's a fine place for this card to exist in. We've seen Jessica Jones, maybe harder, maybe easier, depending on how you think about it, not really do anything at this stat line. I think Rescue getting into Surtur Scar lists would just be a good thing, even though it's very likely for it just to be Scar. Again, green power, pretty safe place for you to put power as long as people are still playing Shadow King. Largely, I think this one's kind of free. I think this is one of the very few +1 points that they could actually do that would make a card hit a breakpoint. Because when I looked at the list, there were 10 cards that people did not bring to the Golden Gauntlet, and a lot of them were in some combination of cards that I didn't necessarily have a good idea for changing, or cards like Baron Mordo, where it's like, I don't know why I would want to make that card any stronger than it already is. Just a bunch of stuff that didn't feel super appealing, but these three all felt like real things. Like, I don't know how much I can do about Warpath and Namor and Orca, right? Those cards kind of just are what they are, and I don't even think they make the game that much better if they're that much stronger. But these cards, I think, could actually make the game better. And that's, again, one of the overriding goals of what I'm thinking about when I'm doing this. My process is very much about, would this make the game more fun? Would this make the game more balanced? Would this make the game more future-proof? And I think when you look at what the FAUXTA I'm proposing here, the first three are about balance and future-proofing. The next three, well, two of the next are, of course, the Mobius and Stardust thing. Those are about future-proofing. The Kingpin one is about balance. The last three are about making the game more fun. And I think that that is one of the things that I try to think about a lot, because like the goal for me isn't get the game to a perfectly balanced state. The goal is to use balance to make the game more fun. And so when I address these tech cards and these cards that are maybe a power outlier like Kingpin or these copy cards, the point is to give the game more replayability by weakening the things that make the game have less replayability. And so that's what I'm doing with the copy cards, or weakening the things that warp entire games around them, like Mobius and Stardust. And you can kind of sort of see what I'm going for here. And it's the inverse of that for the buffs. I don't want to just like slap +1 power on whatever. I want to do stuff that will actually change the perception and understanding and role of the card, like with Deadpool, Wade Wilson, or with this card going into Scar decks. I want these things to open up new space and not just be, let's fill up this OTA with things that are happening. And that's sort of the ethos that I took into this video. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Let me know what you think of the video in the comments. It's been a little bit since I've done a FAUXTA. As always, I will see you in the next one.